I've been personally bird watching or interested in natural history since a young child, more of which later. But certainly over the 50 years plus, we've been very lucky to travel in pursuit of our hobby, natural history, bird watching particularly. I've read quite a few books, I've been quite a few places, and heard a few stories. And that's really what tonight's about. It came about a few years ago when we started to think about all these various places we've been and things we've experienced, and including people in my work environment who said, I don't know what it is you see in birds, what do you get out of it, what's it all about? And I realized that, and I tried to tell them that birds are around us all the time, they're there to be enjoyed, and actually they're part of everybody's daily life if you think about it, even in the phrases and the words we use. And I demonstrated it by, we're not changing slides, so that's the first technical hitch. Here we go. I just threw a few things at them. As the crow flies, they're always crowing about something, you know, that horrible raucous noise the crow makes, as some people describe it. They're always crowing about it. Up with the lark. These are phrases that people use in their daily lives and probably don't realize how important and how relevant birds are to their daily lives, as bald as a coot, swan song, swanning around. I could go on and on and on, water off a duck's back. And if you've just had lunch or dinner, perhaps like us, you may even eat like a gannet. So they're just a few examples I give to people as to how birds are relevant to them, whether they know it or not. But I'm going to start way back, and this was one of the earliest trips Brenda and I went on together back in the early 80s to ancient Egypt, when you could do the 600-mile Nile Cruise from Cairo all the way down to Aswan. And it was really a cultural trip that we were making. I did take a telescope and binoculars. And as we just sailed out of Cairo the first evening, we were very naive overseas travelers at the time. And just to see the huge number of egrets coming into roost by the library just out of Cairo, and to realize how important the Nile must have been and still is today as a migration route. Birds follow rivers, as we know. And just to see these hundreds and hundreds of egrets coming into roost was just the first bird watching experience of that trip. But the future experiences on that trip came in a different form, because almost every cultural visit we made, temple, tomb, we were confronted with birds. And here at Edfu, for instance, this is Horus, clearly a falcon, the solar god, wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And just looking at the hieroglyphics, I realized quite quickly that birds were very, very much part of the ancient Egyptian language. One or two animals or amphibians perhaps, but mostly birds were used. And as we went into some of the temples, this is on the west bank at Thebes, Ramesses III, and just look at the reliefs around the walls of some of these historical monuments that have been there for 2,000–3,000 years BC. And just to look along the top of that frieze, you can see some carvings there that are clearly birds that we could recognize today, including the falcon in the bottom left there carrying the solar disk, which features in many of their pictures and artwork. But along the top, you've got the vultures. The Egyptian vulture, as it happens, features very, very rarely in Egypt today and in history, but there are many African species of vulture that would have occurred. The sacred ibis, we know that they were bred in captivity, kept as pets, and many, many hundreds were found mummified in the tombs of kings and queens. Very, very important part of their culture. And there's an eagle there at the top. And we were sitting watching a sonulemier at Karnak one evening, and a barn owl drifted across as we were watching the sun at Lumiere, and you can see an owl depicted at the top right-hand corner of that relief. And then you go into some of the tombs, and we were told, we know that in the afterlife, they would take to the afterlife what they enjoyed in the here and now. And here we have a young Prince Nebuchadnezzar, clearly out in the papyrus. They're fishing or hunting. He's got a cat there, which would perform the role of a retriever today perhaps, but the variety of waterfowl depicted there was just quite extraordinary. And then when we went to Karnak on the east bank, and we were told that we were going to visit a botanical garden, and naively I thought we were going to see something like Kew Gardens. That's how naive we were. But we went into the King's Botanical Garden, and this was it. It was all carved around the walls of this part of the temple at Karnak. And you can see one or two birds there. But the extraordinary thing here is that if this bird here at the top is a black kite, it wouldn't surprise me, because this picture, as poor as it is, taken many, many years ago on slide film, was of a black kite flying over Karnak Temple being mobbed by a hooded crow. And this is further evidence around the botanical garden of some of the birds that were carved out here. And I hope you can see them okay on this relatively smaller screen than you would in an open meeting. But these are birds we saw on the Nile, the oyster catcher. We saw shell ducks and cormorants on the left there. And if you can see the lapwing depicted on the right hand, you can see the plume, the crest of that lapwing in its full breeding plumage, which is extraordinary. And even more extraordinary was when we went to Beni Hassan. And sadly, some of these places are just inaccessible now since the cruises down the Nile have been limited and restricted in the places that they go. But the Egyptian guide by now knew that we were interested in birds, and he actually gave me his torch and his pointing stick and said, "Okay, Ralph, can you identify these?" I think he thought it was a challenge for me, but such was the beauty and special work that still exists 3,000–4,000 years on, that it was quite easy to identify perhaps masked shrike, redback shrike, and hoopoe, birds that we saw on the cruise down the Nile. This just really totally inspired us and made us realize that birds have been important to people for so many years. Another trip we did in the 1980s was another extraordinary trip, and you'll hear a little bit more about this in the crane talk next year. But we went to China, one of the first groups to go to China to look for the Siberian cranes at Lake Poyang. But of course, we spent much of the time in the larger cities, in Peking as it was then, and Xi'an, and just looking at, again, the Summer Palace in Peking, or Beijing as it now is, and looking at the corridor that we walked through. If you go in to look at the ceiling in a bit more detail, these are paintings of many hundreds of years ago of the white crane, or the great white crane as they call it in China. We know it as the red-crowned crane, Manchurian crane, but they don't, they call it the great white crane in China. And their carvings, again, their bronzes, their pottery, their ceramics depicted birds. And of course, we now know again that the cranes are very important, not only to Chinese, but to Eastern cultural life. Particularly the white cranes, signs of eternal life, purity and virtue, as what many white birds are in many cultures around the world. And this is a modern hotel in Xi'an that we visited and stayed in for a couple of nights. And this is just a mural around the swimming pool. And again, it shows how important the cranes are to both not only ancient culture, but to modern culture in China today. It was extraordinary to go into one or two of the parks as we did, and to be aware that there was almost no birds at all. It was we learnt that the Cultural Revolution exterminated huge quantities of wildlife in general, birds in particular, thought to be competing for food. So most of the birds we saw were either those being taken out by people in little cages to hang up in the parks, as they were doing here early one morning. Brown laughing thrushes, or huame. They would take them out for a little bit, half an hour's fresh air, and then take them back to their apartments. Or in zoos, or more particularly in the towns and cities where there was always a bird market. And those were most of the small birds that we saw in our travels around China in the 1980s. I think things are improving out there now, fortunately. To get to Lake Poyang in those days, you couldn't go by road. You had to go up the river. And again, a very poor quality slide, I'm afraid, but this was our first and only experience of seeing cormorants being used for fishing. something we didn't learn much about until David Attenborough's series much later on, when we learnt that this is a custom that has been going on for hundreds of years BC, where they use the cormorants to catch fish, tying a bit of string around their neck so that they can swallow the small fish, and encourages them to fish, and then the larger fish are regurgitated into the boats for them to take ashore to markets. So those were two overseas travels that we undertook that really made us aware of how important birds are to people in ancient cultures. Coming way up to date now, we're in the 17th century when the telescope was invented. I don't think it was used commercially until the 1750s, but I was aware when sent this card as to how things have moved on, and how telescopes and optical equipment is now very important in the bird watcher's toolbox. And then as the subject of migration, if you go back to the 17th, 18th century, lots was written about migration and little understood fully about migration. And Brenda and I have been going here to the French lakes since the early 1980s to witness the migration of the cranes. Because when we're talking about migration, I'm sure many of you will have read Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne, where he was one of the pioneers in the 18th century, looking at birds, watching birds, beginning to understand a little bit more about the migration. And he famously stood on the banks of the Thames at Sunbury, sort of musing over what was happening to the swallows, and feeling that they were overwintering in the osier beds by the little village of Sunbury on Thames. And of course he was also the man that started to work out the difference between chiffchaff, willow warbler and wood warbler. And perhaps some of you have been to the village of Selborne, where there's a fantastic museum to him, and this church with the lovely stained glass windows, just reflecting on Gilbert White and the work he did and the creatures he so loved in that part of Hampshire. Because migration is reflected in many, many ways and forms. And as you travel around this country, pub signs are a fairly good giveaway as to perhaps those areas that are important for migration. This happens to be the Three Swallows up in Norfolk near Clyde, but there's pubs called the Doctrell up in Yorkshire, or the Curlew down in Sussex, where these birds perhaps have migrated through. And then we're reminded as we look at the countryside, and there's a huge amount being discussed about the countryside, rewilding it, and we're aware of how much we've influenced the countryside over the years. And this is a very much a man-made environment that we're looking at here. I guess the majority of us would say what a wonderful scene it is, but it's very much influenced by us and what we've done, using wood and trees in ancient times for housing, for shipping. And then, of course, somebody else like Capability Brown, also operating in the 18th century, had a huge impact on the landscape, this countryside landscape. Many of the industrialists who were making lots of money had these huge houses built and had the countryside around them landscaped by Capability Brown. And we can see that in many of the places. This happens to be at Petworth down in Sussex, but we can see it reflected in many parts of the country. And when those industrialists took on these big houses, built these houses with these wonderful grounds, some of them were able to do the grand tours and travels, but many of them just asked other people to bring exotic birds and animals back to these estates. And again, we can see that reflected today in some collections. And I guess the most famous of all is the Peacock that we see here at Nunnington Hall up in Yorkshire. This is Lilford Hall in Northamptonshire, the home of the Baron Lilford, 4th Baron of Northamptonshire, and again reflecting back on those people who travelled and brought species back both for ornamental reasons. But in the case of Lord Lilford, one of the early naturalists living in the 18th century, he was writing, he was studying birds. He had lammergeiers, bearded vultures, free flying in the village of Lilford. And you can't imagine what it must have been like walking around the village with these birds flying around. But here we see a picture of him painted by Archibald Thorburn, one of the great ornithological artists of the 19th century. Just a picture of Lord Lilford here in his study, jackdaw looking over his shoulder as he writes about a peregrine falcon, which in those days, of course, they had no other way of studying these birds really, other than to either see them in flight or to shoot them and to study them in detail in close quarters like this. Again, things have moved on, but we are so grateful for the work that these people did 200 years ago to enlighten us on the early forms of natural history and bird study. And we can't mention early naturalists in the 19th century really without talking about Charles Darwin, who went on that incredible voyage on the Beagle. He was out there for 5 years, and most famously, I guess, for his work in Galapagos, where he only spent 5 weeks. But it was here that spurred him into thinking about evolution and how birds like the finch, the many finches that he saw there, 13, 14 species of finch, that all seemed to be very similar, but they all had a different niche, feeding niche, nesting niche. The cormorants that he noticed didn't fly, they were flightless cormorants. Why was that? The swallowtail gull with its white beak and white spot on its beak, as opposed to the yellow and red beak spot that are the gulls that he'd been familiar with. Well, they feed at night, so they needed a different identification for the young to peck at. So a white spot in darkness is evolutionary quite incredible. And he started to notice these things and jot them all down, write them all down. And of course, close to where we live in Bexley, over in the next borough of Bromley, is Down House, where he did most of his work, and not only writing the origin of species, but also studying here at Down Bank the relationship between pollinators and insects. What an incredible man, and what an incredible amount of work he did here in the South London borough of Bromley. Coming further up to date to the 20th century, Victorian times, things were different. Egg collecting birds, having them stuffed, taxidermy were very big, popular businesses in those days. And this was a collection of eggs that was taken just literally before the RSPB centenary in 1989, about 26,000 eggs taken from a house in Dartford, again near where we live. But it was the birds like the great crested grebe and the egrets that were perhaps the real backbone of why the Fur and Feather Society was formed in 1889, which went on to become the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. A group of ladies, one of whom is being really immortalized with a statue at the moment, Emily Williamson, were aware of how much feathers were being used in the millinery trade. And London, 13 years up to the period 1889, was thought to be the hub of the millinery and the feather trade. 4,500 tons of feathers coming through there in 13 years. And if you think that 6 of those plumes off the egret weigh probably less than an ounce, you can imagine how many birds were slaughtered, birds of paradise, egrets and the like, slaughtered for the millinery trade. And great crested grebes, those lovely plumes around the head, used in both fly fishing industry and in the millinery trade. And this is where the group of ladies met up in Didsbury to form that first group, the Fur and Feather Society, which, as I said, went on to become the RSPB. But terrible use of birds and wildlife in the fashion industry. But it went on until the 1920s before they got legislation to outlaw it. But even in those very early days of the RSPB and the RSNC, the Royal Society for Nature Conservation, which was formed in 1912, and the National Trust that was formed in 1895, there were many, many other conservation issues that they were aware of, not least the importance of the British Isles for the seabird colonies that we had breeding around our wonderful, wonderful coastline. And it's an extraordinary thing that at this very moment these birds will be back in their hundreds of thousands nesting around not only the British Isles but many other parts of northern European coastline, Iceland and the like. But they were aware even then of the dangers to these birds, not just from today's modern problems of oil pollution, but of course many seabirds with eggs were used, and the birds were taken for food. We lost the great auk in this country, in St Kilda, in 1840, and lost it altogether. We believe there was a paper in British Birds just recently discussing the last great auk, but it's felt that the last one was shot on Eldey in Iceland in 1844. And of course, right up until the time the St Kildans left the island in the 1930s, they were still harvesting fulmars sustainably for food that they would salt down to keep throughout the year to provide them with much needed food. And the RSPB and other conservation organisations way back realised how important our coastline was for these species, and there had to be this balance which they worked on. As a young person, I was very interested in bird watching, but I don't think I really had any awareness of environment, the word environment or conservation, until the Torrey Canyon disaster in 1967. But reading the history, the first oil prosecution happened in 1921, I think it was, but through conservationists being aware of that being a problem all those years back. Fortunately, we touch wood that we haven't had so many disasters in recent years, but they continued throughout the latter part of the 20th century. And in the early 20th century, the idea of acquiring land or managing land for species became more high profile, and I concentrate on the RSPB a little here because the RSPB has been very important to Brenda and I in our growth through our interest in the natural history and our opportunities we've had, but also because we live in Kent. Dungeness is one of our favourite locations, and indeed it was one of the first purchasers of the RSPB. They actually had watchers here protecting the nests of stone curlews and wheatears and the like in the early 1900s, but they managed it as a nature reserve from 1931, and they've subsequently developed it. As you probably know, you visited it, I'm sure, and you see a number of hides have been erected around these wonderful gravel pits. You can sit in there and get great views of a nuclear power station, in addition to all the myriad wildfowl, gulls and terns at this time of the year. And indeed the power station itself provides an outfall that is very interesting if you're a gull watcher or a seabird watcher. And of course you have the bird observatory in the distance as well. And today, who would have thought, and I'm sure the RSPB had absolutely no idea when they started this project nearly 90 years ago, that you could go there on some occasions and see these three species in one visit to the great white, the little and the cattle egret. How extraordinarily times have changed. But there were other conservationists at work. Peter Scott, for instance, in 1947, a renowned scientist, wildfowler himself, established the Wildfowl Trust, or the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, here at Slimbridge, and he had a different objective really for to the existing organisations. He wanted not only to have a place for wildfowl, to protect wildfowl, to study wildfowl, to use the waters and understand the nature of the habitats that they required, but also to rescue, if you like, or to save some endangered species around the world, which we most famously did with the Hawaiian goose or the nene, releasing it back to its homelands once the conditions and habitats and the previous threats had been put to rest, and they could return safely to their home ground. And around the same time, again, 1947, I think it was, the RSPB acquired the fantastic and famous Minsmere Nature Reserve, a reserve that was really created out of another human tragedy, if you like, which was the Second World War, when the East Anglian defences were flooded to prevent the enemy coming ashore. And what was left after this was a magnificent piece of wetland that was managed by the well-known reserve warden of the time, Herbert Axel, developing an idea of scrapes where birds could rest, loaf around, nest, the famous Minsmere scrape, and the return of the avocet, which was something else that coincided with the waters of the reserve in the 1940s, returning after many years' absence. This isn't a six-legged avocet, by the way. This is an avocet with a couple of chicks there. It went on, so famous, to become the logo of the RSPB. So celebrated was the return of the avocet to our shores, and you can see in the bottom left-hand corner there the many forms that the logo has taken over the years. In the right-hand corner there, I'm absolutely sure I'm right in saying that I read around the time when they changed the logo from the traditional upright avocet there to the little square box that you can see eventually. That came about, I'm sure I read at the time, because the European Union sort of only allowed you to have these brown road signs for designating famous and well-known visitor attractions. It had to be in a square format on a brown sign, and you can see these signs all over the country as you travel around. So the RSPB had to change its logo accordingly to fit in with the requirements of the bureaucrats, either in Whitehall or Brussels, who knows. That's what I read at the time. I think probably for Brenda and I, one of the most important things in conservation happened before we were together, but it happened here at Lochgarten in the 1950s when the osprey returned. Probably one of the greatest conservation stories in recent history, because this bird has done so much for public awareness. George Waterston, the then warden, who promoted these birds when there was only one pair nesting or known to be nesting at Lochgarten in Scotland, he then 1959 put it out into public domain. 14,000 people turned up within a few weeks to see these birds. How extraordinary is that if you think about the transport network in the late 1950s to get to Lochgarten? But I think that was one of the key things, and these birds featured in the Daily Mirror and various newspapers every year, well into the early 1970s, their return and arrival. And as I said, people flocked here to see these birds, and over 2 million people have now been to just this one site. Sadly, ospreys haven't nested here for the last 3 years now, I think it is, but what a legacy that one species has given the conservation movement, I would suggest. Also in the early 1960s, I don't know how many of you read this book, The Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson, but it's a very interesting read. Even today, it has some resonance with many of the issues we're discussing and thinking about and worrying about. She published this book after much research on the use of pesticides, insecticides, and the impact they were having on the web of life, the life cycle of these major predators that were feeding on the food chain, and the decimation that this was having. And she came to the conclusion it was insects. And only yesterday, I think it was Springwatch was talking about the lack of insects for different reasons, perhaps. But the giant US chemical companies ridiculed her, called her a communist. They just would not accept it. But to his credit, President Kennedy had a big research project undertaken that proved her right. And of course, these were banned, and they were later banned in the UK as well. And places like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and even the US Environment Protection Agency credit this book with their actual existence. They came to being because of the work that she had done and the publicity that she got through this book. And of course, peregrines are back now, they're thriving. We lost them almost entirely in the 50s and 60s into the 70s, but we now have them. We've got 2 pairs breeding in the London borough of Bexley now, so a remarkable recovery. So we're now into the 60s, aren't we? And I'm just coming up to being a teenager. This is me. I don't know where I dare say this to the Essex Birdwatching Society, but this is me in my Ipswich Town supporters hat, with my little field guide and a pair of binoculars, just getting into bird watching in a proper way. I thought bird watching was a modern hobby until I went into a museum in Greece, I think it was, and saw this statue and realized obviously there's been bird watching going on for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But this is what inspired me, other than, should I say, my granddad, who used to take me out in the countryside birds nesting in the 1950s, late 1950s. But coupled with that, these were the things that inspired me, the tea cards, and the cigarette cards that I collected, and the books I had bought for me, the Ladybird series books that I've still got today, and my Observers books, which are, again, I'm sure many of you started your bird watching with at least the Observers books, if not the Ladybird books. But now, well, this is just a small selection. I saw Steve had a huge selection of books behind him when he was on screen a little while ago, and I guess many of us have got similar collections, but this is just a part of my collection of field guides that are available to us now. What an extraordinary progress we've made there, and now of course it's all on the laptops, on your mobile phones. You've got it all technology to hand. Again, how extraordinary things have moved so relatively quickly. How many years did we carry the Peterson guide around with us with no real alternative until perhaps the Collins guide came out? I also think that when you start to see birds used in adverts or cartoons, then you know that they're making a connection with the wider public. Perhaps the picture on the left typifies an image of a bird watcher in the 60s, perhaps a bit eccentric with the country sort of gentleman's clothing on. But I saw this advert way back in the cartoon, way back in I think it was the Daily Mirror, one of the papers, way back in the 70s, and I just thought that was it. Great, that's great. Keep it amused while I identify it. And this was another one, just another little cartoon in another paper. I think they know we're watching them, so they're sort of producing a song and dance routine. Well, they certainly would know they're watching them, because this was a picture taken not too many years ago of what we now would call a twitch, but how things have moved on since the 60s. This was me in 1963 again. I was up for a paper round, and I was phoned up, and my parents were contacted, not phoned up, we didn't have a telephone, they phoned up, contacted, should I say, to see whether I'd do this paper round. And it was that horrible winter of 63. It snowed for 3 months, or it was frozen for 3 months in the first period of my experience as a paper boy. But it was also a time when I was able to get on the bike and go out on my own, and sort of, you might recognize this, depending on which part of Essex you come from. This is the River Orwell. It's not how it looks. When I was there, there was a power station there, and there was no bridge there when I was bird watching there. And I remember going there in that winter with the Orwell freezing up, the mud freezing up, and birds being frozen into the mud, and collecting them and taking them home to sort of warm up. I also remember seeing large flocks of birds flying up and down the Orwell. I hadn't got a clue. My Observer's book of birds didn't show me birds in flight. I now know, of course, they would be dunlin, they might be redshank, there's sometimes golden plover flocks there that we see if we visit the game, as we do occasionally. But this was the year 1963, or the winter of 63, when, again, I think this was a momentous shift in people's attitude to wildlife and to birds in particular. Again, we didn't have a telephone, we didn't have a television, so I can't tell you what all the television programs were saying, but I know there were programs like Look with Peter Scott, I think it was, perhaps Tony Soper had a program, and they were in the radio and the newspapers, they were telling us how to feed the birds, that birds needed us to provide food for them. So I was going out and getting peanuts and threading peanuts and the like, and little birds coming to the garden like the robin. We were told that they needed food and water to sustain them through this cold period. They didn't have the facilities to keep themselves warm as we're able to just switch the heating back on and off. They need food to sustain themselves. We were told to keep water clear, no matter how you had that water. We had an upside down dustbin lid just buried in the ground, but ornamental bird baths were worth having if you didn't have a pond. And these all fit today as well. They're all as important messages today as they were in that hard winter of 1963. And we have a very small pond in the garden, but we attract a good range of birds, including this jay last autumn. How many remember this, I wonder? The silver top milk bottle with the blue tits coming down to feed on them. This was a regular thing we would see coming up to perhaps the 1970s, when, well, the milk that we had in the 50s and 60s was often full cream milk, and there'd be a cream on the top that these birds could use and take for nourishment. They can't actually tolerate the lactose in pure milk. And of course, in the 70s and 80s, we started to move over to semi-skimmed and skimmed milk. And by the 1980s, how many people actually had milk bottles delivered to their doorstep anyway? It's something of the past. But these are memories I have that we can reflect on, and I suspect one or two of you might be as well. Who remembers the first, well, in my opinion, the first commercially produced bird food, swoop, that we found in the local pet shops? It's extraordinary. This is an advert from an early RSPB magazine for the tomtit feeder. Fantastic, isn't it? Fantastic. We were told to build bird tables to feed the birds on, and where to position the bird table so that the local cats couldn't get at them and hide away and pounce on the birds on the bird table. All these instructions were being given out on the radio and in newspapers during that harsh winter of 63, and they continue to this day. The message is the same. It's just the quality and the quantity of things are so different. If you go into any garden centre or even the mainstream supermarkets will have racks of bird food and supplies. I read just a couple of days ago in some magazine that we now spend over £250 million a year on bird food and the provisions for birds. Over half the population are thought to feed garden birds. So that's a wonderful progress, and how influence and how much influence the press and publicity has on our need and desire and willingness to feed garden birds. And these are just two of the birds that are now regular to our garden. Wouldn't have been there in the 1960s for sure. Both of these species are relatively new and increasing numbers around here, goldfinch and ringneck parakeets. We might get 5 goldfinches and 7 or 8 ringneck parakeets every day on our feeders. And during the 60s, living in Suffolk or living in Ipswich and holidaying at grandparents in Suffolk, I was very aware of the hedgerows that I went nesting with my granddad, and how life changed when I first took Brenda to Ipswich in the 70s, and many of the fields that we nested in had birds nested in. The hedges had gone and the fields were much larger. And of course, we're all very aware and saddened at the loss of many of those farmland birds that we just took for granted as early bird watchers in the 60s, yellowhammers, grey partridge, and bullfinches, for instance. It was only 20 years ago that Brenda and I, 1995, we made our first visit to Lesbos in Greece, and this was one of the farming scenes that met us in Lesbos. And fortunate to travel in many places, Poland and Kazakhstan, where you can still see meadows like this, and we shouldn't have to return. We can't return to those agricultural practices to produce wonderful fields like this. But today we're seeing so much publicity now about growing plants such as this, meadows such as this, not knowing hedgerow, grass verges and the like, to try and enable these pollinating plants to grow. But of course, this is a small island country, really, isn't it? And so many pressures. This one typifies an old picture of industry, housing and agriculture. We're trying to squeeze them all in, but it's not all bad news. Some of our human developments have enhanced the wildlife around us, and this is just a couple of our local sites down in Kent. And the top, we've got the Bow Beach Reservoir, man-made habitat. And below that is the Sevenoaks Wildfowl Reserve, Wildlife Reserve, developed with the Harrison brothers, two well-known sort of wildfowlers, stroke ornithologists, who got together with Kent Sand and Ballast when they first started digging a hole in the ground in the 1930s and said, can you create edges so that we can have wildfowl loafing around the edges so that we can shoot them, basically. But they were also great conservationists like Peter Scott. And it's now a thriving, very, very popular and important nature reserve. Home, both of those sites are home to the bird that just 100 years previously would have been under threat, the great crested grebe. We now have good populations, both breeding and particularly winter. And I know in Essex you have equally good reservoirs and gravel pits that you have these birds to enjoy. And birds that have come to those habitats that wouldn't perhaps normally be associated as inland birds, the cormorant, we have them in our local park lake now, and I know Abberton Reservoir was possibly the first place that cormorants nested. I'm not sure if that's 100% accurate, but could well be. But they're not everybody's friend, of course. They're not a fisherman's friend. There are conflicts of interests with birds and wildlife, and we have to be aware of that. And some people pay a lot of money for their fishing rights, and we need to be aware of the conflict between some of these habitats and the birds that they attract and what might be an outcome. Of course, the cormorant has a bit of history as well, no more so than the wonderful liver buildings in Liverpool, where two 18-foot bronze statues of cormorants. I understand the architect was commissioned to do two eagles, but they finished up with what appeared to be two cormorants, which now appear on all of the headed notepaper and the emblems of Liverpool, and not least the wonderful Liverpool Football Club. The cormorant is there. And it often makes me smile that you could have a whole gang of Liverpool supporters at Anfield on a Saturday chanting away for their team with the cormorant as its logo, and then when they go to the local reservoir the following day to do some fishing, it's the enemy number one is the cormorant. And people have been involved in developing the knowledge of birds and wildlife over the years. The first Bird Observatory was opened in the 1930s at Skocum, the most recent at Alderney in 2017, and Brenda and I spend a month down at Portland every autumn with Martin Cade here looking at the various species that he's able to ring, and we've got a willow warbler and chiffchaff able to show us the difference between those species in the hand. More and more people have become citizen scientists through organisations like the BTO, one of my favourite charities. The BTO do some fantastic work with a relatively small membership compared with the wildlife trusts and the RSPB, but certainly do some fantastic work through the garden bird watch for people just enjoying birds from their home, to the breeding bird survey and many, many other surveys that I'm sure some of you participate in. British Birds started way back in 1907, and I think it was, and still going strong today. But it was many, many years before it was joined by there was a number of attempts at bird watching type magazines through the years, not least those of John Gooders. But bird watching and Birdwatch both started in the 1980s and are still going with us today, some 30 years on. So there's much more accessible information popularizing bird watching today than there was many years ago. And also in the 1980s, coming more up to date now, we had the launch and the start of the Bird Fair, the British Bird Watching Fair as it was originally called. And I guess many of us, and I see some of you at the Bird Fair when we're up there wondering what's going to happen. Will we ever see the Bird Fair again? There seems to be some considerable skepticism and doubt in many regular attendees' minds that we'll ever get together again in such an environment. But what a wonderful, wonderful organisation that was for the years that it ran and the money that it put back into international conservation. You can go there and spend a huge amount of money on books, optical equipment, but I think artwork. And I think the great thing about the bird fair was just the social size of it, and the people you met perhaps only once a year. And I and Brenda certainly miss that enormously. There's also the opportunity to find out about holidays and birdwatching holidays around the world, and it brings me on to travel and to the various trips we've made. And we've been lucky enough to travel both as tour guides ourselves and on private holidays. And just a couple of examples, somewhere like Florida, for instance, where most people, including Brenda and I, have visited for the Disneylands and the Epcot centres, but also to see somewhere like Cape Canaveral up in northern Florida, just to see this huge human person orientated environment here, rockets and space travel, combined with this huge area of natural habitats around there which birds and wildlife can enjoy. And here you've got the Florida scrub jay, for instance. They're really one of the only places you can see this species in this environment up there, which has hardly any disturbance by the sheer nature of the activities that are carried out there. And one of my favourite places in the world, I would say, let alone Florida, is here at Bunch Beach, which is just near Sanibel Island, just before you get on the Sanibel Island. Stayed there many occasions, and just this lovely beach with a huge variety of species here. Black skimmers, they seem totally unperturbed by the amount of activity on the beach, whether it be people walking, photographers, people just sunbathing as the tide comes in, and they all gather around her. This lady hadn't got a clue what they were. She eventually did look up and ask me what those black things were surrounding her chair, but black skimmers. And it was another trip to the States. Another favorite place of ours is Texas. And it can be the only place in the world where they make a tourist attraction out of a landfill site. And it reminds me again just how much rubbish we produce and what influence we have on some of the species that now visit our gardens regularly, perhaps brought here by the nearby landfill sites, whether that be crows, magpies or gulls that come to our gardens. Well, here in Brownsville, Texas, as I said, they make a tourist attraction out of their rubbish dump or their landfill site. You can get a plan at the gate, and you can drive around, and if you're a completely bonkers bird watcher, which some people would say we are, you would go right up to the landfill to see the myriad species there, whether it be the turkey vultures, the range of gulls, the grackles, a huge variety of species that you can get close to at these landfill sites. But there's a message there, isn't there, that we shouldn't really, and hopefully we won't be producing so much rubbish, but in future. And from one extreme to the other, we've been lucky enough to visit Antarctica on a couple of occasions in South Georgia. And this is a complete contrast to anything that you will find in North America, well, certainly in Texas and Florida, this pristine wilderness area visited by a number of people these days, lucky enough to visit there. But how humbling it is to just be able to sit in this environment and enjoy and watch and study species, birds that are really totally unconcerned about us. They've lived so long without human interaction that they almost allow us to just be part of their daily lives. What a humbling experience that is, to just sit and watch a gentoo penguin just walk literally by the end of your feet, or just sit as a snowstorm arrives and just embrace you, so encompasses the whole colony of these gentoo penguins, and to be part of that and to realize how important it is that we understand and appreciate how these animals live and what impact we can have on them, whether that be through climate change today or the impacts we've had in the past at places like Stromness down in South Georgia, whereas this really horrible historic monument, if you like, to the decimation of the whale population that we enforced on this area back in the early 20th up to the mid 20th century. And albatrosses, of course, are one of the key species that you see and want to see when you're traveling down there. And we now know that through our activities in the fishing industry, longline fishing, that 15 of the 22 species of albatross are very under threat. But like most of the issues we raise, most of the problems we cause, we know the answers, or we can find the answers, and we can produce the answers. And HookPod is up for an award for as we speak, I believe. I'm not sure it's been announced, but this is developed by a British company to help the albatrosses by not catching the fish off these long hooks that they have. I won't go into the technical way it works, but it's an innovation that is hopefully helping to protect and save many thousands of albatrosses. So that brings us on, doesn't it, quite nicely. And I know some of you travel abroad, and we all have that, I suppose, on our conscience. You know, how much do we fly? What are the impacts on our travels? What are the impacts on our personal lives, on the environment around us, on the birds around us, and equally further afield? And it's something I'm sure we all grapple with. In Essex, you know, the idea of a Thames airport goes back into the 1950s. For the first many years, on the Essex side of the Thames, Foulness comes to mind. But most recently, it was on the Kent side, on our side, on the Cliff Marshes here. And that brought together communities like no other campaign I had known up to that point. We have a similar one going on at the moment for Swanscombe Marshes, where there's the threat of a Disneyland type theme park. But these are some young guys. Some of you might recognize Barry Wright on the left there. He doesn't change at all, but I just thought that was an incredibly ingenious poster, egrets, not regrets, when we were fighting that campaign for the No Airport at Cliff, which we thought we'd won until dear old Boris comes along in 2008 and resurrects the whole project. But we're hoping that it's gone away for good, but one never knows with planning developments in this day and age. You can fight 2 or 3 times, but eventually they seem to win. But we hope they won't win on either side of the Thames, north or south, another airport. So we become conservationists, some of us have become activists, participate in demonstrations. Just a couple of 3 years ago, there was the March for Wildlife organised by Mark Avery and Chris Packham and others out of Hyde Park down to Whitehall. But we were only repeating what was going on over 100 years ago, when those ladies were trying to outlaw the use of plumes in the millinery trade, and people were out on the streets of London then with their banners demonstrating against the use of those plumes. So we're still doing what they were doing over 100 years ago, perhaps sometimes more focused now than some of these bigger demonstrations, focusing on hen harriers. And so most years at Rainham Marshes, under normal conditions, there's a hen harrier day, usually attended by Chris Packham and 1 or 2 others, just to raise the profile of the problems that individual species and habitats are having, and the impact we're having on those through our own activities. So what are the solutions? We know some of the solutions. Some of them are easier, some of them not. Solar farms, solar farms such as here on the top, wind farms at sea, offshore or on land. Are they the solutions? Well, probably they are, but they come with their own problems. Only yet recently we've heard of vultures being killed by the wind farms. There's every evidence to suggest that if the solar farms are managed properly, they could actually provide good habitat for ground nesting birds in undisturbed environments. So these are all issues we have to grapple with. And I use this slide just to remind me to sort of, we're getting close to the end, that it's not all doom and gloom, but we can't just sit on the fence. We need to be aware of what the issues are. We've had so many great adventures and pleasures out of wildlife and birds. Equally, we have perhaps been partly to the cause of some of the problems as well. So we can't sit on the fence. The first overseas trip Brenda and I did actually was in 1981. Some of you may know Trevor Gunton. He was very much involved in the establishment of local groups at the RSPB. He's a close personal friend of ours. And he invited us to go. His family were going to California for 3 weeks, and we invited us to go. We didn't know his wife or his daughter, but we went. And it's me on the right there, very young, brown hair, no glasses, but we went, and we had a fantastic 3 weeks. And the last 2 days we were going to be not far from Los Angeles, and we had planned to go to Mount Pinus to see, hopefully, California condor, of which there were only 25 left in the country at the time. And we knew that American bird watchers were spending their whole fortnight holiday, some of them sitting, camping up there, hoping to see a California condor. Well, we arrived, we walked up there. It's quite a stiff walk up to the mountain, and we met a number of these people, some of whom had been there for 2 weeks and hadn't seen a California condor. Well, we got up there, and within 45 minutes of us arriving and talking to these people, 3 California condors went down the valley. Now, I don't know whether they were pleased to see us or absolutely fed up with us that we'd just had 45 minutes and seen these birds. I'm not sure. But the reason that California condors were lost was purely through lack of habitat, loss of habitat, and sort of diversion of waterways into Los Angeles, and the impact of that had on the habitat. Well, a great success story, like many others that we could talk about, but they have reintroduced the California condor to 2 or 3 areas, both in California and the Grand Canyon. And this bird is now back from the brink and hopefully has a future. And we've had similar successes in this country, and I won't say failures, but something like the red kite. Who would have thought we would be having red kites over Essex and Kent and southern parts, some parts of London? What an extraordinary reintroduction program that was. The crane seems to be doing remarkably well. The corncrake, perhaps, it's having a slightly more difficult time, but there are many other such projects underway with the sea eagle, and perhaps the most famous of all is Roy Dennis and the ospreys at Rutland Water. Because not only have we been able to reintroduce the osprey to England, although they turned up of their own accord up in the Lake District the same year and bred successfully, but these birds we now know have enabled populations to establish in Wales and 1 or 2 other places. But also, having these birds available in the numbers that they were able to start looking more closely at their movements and adding satellite trackers. And this whole technology has been developed, and we're now able to see where ospreys go, how long it takes them to get there, what the dangers are on their routes. And this technology has now been introduced in recent years to a whole range of species, with geolocators going on smaller birds to understand nightjars, swifts, and a whole range of species. So it is the vision of people like the guys who reintroduced the California condor, to the Roy Dennises, to the Peter Scotts, who always had a vision that he would love to have conservation and nature in the heart of a big city, and came up with the idea, working with Thames Water and Barratt Homes, to establish the Barnes Wetland Centre. Sadly, he died before it came to final fruition, but it was his vision that enabled this to happen. Organisations like the Wildlife Trusts and the RSPB, who worked for years and years and years, in the case of the RSPB, to acquire Rainham Marshes and to be able to establish them as a nature reserve that people right on the edge of London could enjoy. And it's our nearest RSPB reserve. We go there very often, and most weekends we'll go there, and there'll be more people walking around there without binoculars than there are with binoculars. Such is the appreciation that people have of just having an open space to walk around and be aware of nature around them, even if they don't study it and enjoy it in perhaps the same way that we do with our binoculars and telescopes and cameras. Just a fantastic place right on the edge of London. But even on our own doorsteps, and we've all got these places on our doorsteps, hopefully some open spaces. This just happens to be one of 100 open spaces in the London Borough of Bexley, a place called Footscray Meadows that we go to, where people can go horse riding, they can do almost any activity here, but it's a place that we over the years have introduced many people to birds and bird watching through just common birds like the gulls and the mallards and the Canada geese. And we're aware that not everybody appreciates it, not everybody sees it in that way, and that sort of awareness has been heightened over the last year with so many great stories, but equally so many destructive stories, and people who just throw motorbikes or cars or even supermarket trolleys in the River Cray that runs through Footscray Meadows. Is they don't appreciate what's there, because we've got kingfishers nesting along that river, which is I defy anybody to find a bird much more beautiful than the kingfisher that we have on our own doorstep. We don't have to travel to great countries to see beautiful birds and enjoy the behaviour of beautiful birds. And organisations like the RSPB, the Wildlife Trusts, and even sort of local groups are now showing people birds, showing people wildlife. This happens to be down at Chichester, the Peregrines at Chichester, where we're getting young people enthused. And the thing I'm most impressed with now, I've only just joined Twitter over the last few months, but the number of young people on Twitter who are getting active and actually doing stuff is fantastic. The best I could manage is when friends come over with their kids, the best I could manage is get them to fill up all my bird feeders for me. They seem to enjoy that. And we've got a bit of wild stuff down the bottom of the garden, so we go and collect grasshoppers and any butterflies that down there. And they seem to love that, and they love filling up the feeders and getting involved. And certainly one of those three has really taken an interest in her sort of later life into wildlife. So if they've worked hard for you all day, what's the only thing you can give them as a reward but a penguin, I would suggest. Well, just to finish up, I started off with some sayings, some phrases that we use every day. And I just reflect on, in my life, some of the things where birds have been part of it. The farthing, which was still in existence as a child, smallest coin at the time with our smallest bird on it, the wren. I used to like cider when I got a little bit older, and woodpecker cider associated as cider is with orchards, as indeed our woodpeckers. And of course, we've lost the wryneck from most of the country. Famous grouse, I guess that needs no introduction at all, but how many species could you think of that are used in beers or products? The white stork, a bird that is now nesting here in this country at long last from another reintroduction program, associated across Europe. Again, it's a white bird, so it's associated with virtue and fidelity, and associated with the bringing of babies. And in many parts of Eastern Europe, still very heavily used in the names of nurseries and the like. And the white stork is a bird that is revered in much of Europe, where it nests on high buildings, often on churches. They're welcomed because they're nesting high up, so they must be closer to God. So they're very much a bird that is revered. And what about our own Christmas cards? The robin, how did that come about? Christmas cards was first started to be commercially used in the 1860s, and the robin was featuring on them even then. And one of the theories is that the postman of the day had the little red tunics, and they were called robins. And here's an old picture here of one of the postmen, and so that's how perhaps the robin became so associated with Christmas and Christmas cards, the warm gentleness of a postman delivering a happy greeting. So I think I've really rounded up my own thoughts and meanderings through my own bird watching sort of travels and travels through time. This is a classic advert from many years ago now. If you remember the Guinness adverts, I'm never quite sure how toucans and Guinness were associated, perhaps the black bodies with the white breast before you get to that colourful bill. But what about a logo for this? Toucans in their nests agree, Guinness is good for you. Try some today and see what one or two can do. There you go. That was advertising back in the 90s, 70s. So we started not only with some phrases, but with some artwork or sort of paintings, historical paintings from ancient Egypt. And I just wonder what would happen if somebody comes back in a few hundred years' time and sees some of the street art. I'm very interested in street art. photograph it wherever I see it. But I'm not quite sure what a great bustard has got to do with Whitechapel. Haven't worked that one down. The top picture is Thamesmead, and the owl seems to feature quite heavily in street art. This one's over in Brick Lane area of London, and this one happens to be up at Camden Lock. So we're talking about art in ancient Egypt 3,000 years BC, and now we see birds depicted in street art in the 21st century in all our major cities. So perhaps a slightly different talk to what you might have been expecting, but that's my thoughts on travels through time, birds and people. Thank you very much.